Welcome to the Growing in Love for Life podcast, where it's all about saving and strengthening your marriage and creating the relationship you really deserve and want to have. And now, from growinginloveforlife.com, relationship and marriage coach and best-selling author, your host, Liam Naden.
This is episode 30 of the Growing in Love for Life podcast. Hi everybody, welcome back. It's good to be here and it's good to have you here. And here we are at episode 30. Now, if you're struggling with your marriage, I think you're going to find the topic this week pretty interesting because it's something that I find comes up a lot in my dealings with people through my programs and coaching and even emails I get from people. I'm very often asked this question: am I responsible for making sure my marriage works out? You know, very often people are in this situation, and maybe you are, where they're trying really hard to make their marriage work or to save it from divorce or from some catastrophe, and their husband or wife isn't doing anything at all to help. In fact, they might even be resisting them. So they feel totally responsible for fixing things, for doing it all themselves. And they also feel that if things fall apart, then one of the main reasons was because of what they themselves did or didn't do. So what I want to talk about today in this podcast is to show you that there are some things you're responsible for. Of course there are. But there are other things that you're not responsible for. And it's really important to know the difference. And if you really can get the distinction between the two of them clear, you're going to have a much greater chance of actually saving your marriage and turning it into the relationship you really want. Because what will end up happening is you'll end up doing more of the right things rather than wrong things, and things are going to start heading in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So that's why I've called this podcast episode, Are You Responsible for Your Marriage? And I want to start off by asking you the question: how responsible do you feel for saving your marriage? Do you actually feel that if your marriage is going to survive and give you the happiness that you want, that it depends on you? Now, you might be thinking when I ask you that question, you might be thinking, well, of course I don't want to feel totally responsible. I want my spouse to be responsible as well. But the truth is they're not taking any responsibility. They're not working on it. And I feel like I'm the only one doing the work. So what do you expect me to do? I mean, if I don't take responsibility, then things are just going to carry on the way they are, aren't they? And they're only going to get worse. So you might be thinking those thoughts. And you might have also heard me in one of the previous podcasts where I've talked about the importance of you doing everything you can to save your marriage. So maybe you're a bit confused here. On the one hand, I'm saying you need to do everything you can, you need to take responsibility, and on the other hand, I'm saying that it's not all your responsibility necessarily. And that's, I guess, the key distinction, and that's what we're going to talk about in this podcast, is what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. And this is where most people trip up. I'll be really honest. Most of the people who come to me who work on coaching or work with my coaching with one of my programs, they're tripping up in this. They're confused about where their responsibility starts and where it ends. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, it takes them in the wrong direction. So again, just to summarize, we're going to talk today about what you are responsible for and what you're not responsible for, and the difference. All right, and just another point, so often when our marriage gets into trouble and we want to fix things, we start to do things that seem to be the obvious and the right things to do. I mean, that's logical, isn't it? And we try really hard. But often when we're doing all of these things that we think are the right things just keep getting worse. Maybe you're in that situation. Nothing seems to work. It only seems to make things worse. And that's because what I've discovered is that very often the obvious and logical things that appear to be the right things to do are actually the opposite of what you should be doing. And I cover this in great depth in my Stop Your Divorce and Save Your Marriage programs, where I also show you exactly how the opposite is usually the way to go. But it's the same with the whole area of responsibility in a relationship. Usually people take responsibility for the wrong things, and they don't take responsibility for the right things, which is why they don't get the result they want, which is obviously a happy marriage. So hopefully, after you've listened to today's episode, you're going to be very clear on responsibility, what you're responsible for and what you're not, and you're going to have a new understanding of how you can really work to create a happy marriage for yourself and obviously for your spouse. Now let's get into it. Let's look closely at this whole area of responsibility, what you should be responsible for and what you shouldn't be responsible for. And first off, we're going to take a look at what you should not be responsible for. And as I said earlier, these are things that most people take responsibility for, and it doesn't work. Alright, so the first thing that you really must not be responsible for is how your spouse feels. Right? Now, feeling responsible for your husband or your wife's feelings, for their happiness, how they feel about you, how they feel about your marriage, and anything else in their life, it's not only a bad idea, but it's completely pointless. Seriously, you can't be responsible for the way your spouse feels. And so you shouldn't feel that you should be responsible. Okay? Now, of course, this is a really difficult thing to do, and especially when your spouse is telling you that you are the reason that they feel the way they do, or that you're not doing the things that make them happy, or that you're the reason that they want to end the marriage even. In other words, they're blaming you, and they might be saying things like, look, I don't feel happy in our marriage anymore because of the way you're behaving towards me. Or they might say, you're not attractive to me anymore, as if it's your fault, of course. And they could also be telling you that your marriage problems and the way that they are feeling is because of other problems that they are having in their life. So they could be blaming their feelings on the financial situation or maybe a health issue. And the problem with that is it makes you feel that somehow you are the one who has to find a way to solve these problems. So the truth is, though, they are responsible for the way they feel. And of course there are things that you can do to help them feel better, and obviously you want to do that, but ultimately you need to realize that how they feel is up to them, and I mean totally up to them. So you need to stop blaming yourself or making yourself feel responsible for how they feel. Now, of course, as I said, this is a very difficult thing to do, and the odds are very often stacked completely against us when we try to stop taking responsibility for how they might feel. Because apart from the criticism you might get from them when you start to do that, there may well be pressure from other people for you to change. You know, we've heard that before, I'm sure. And therefore, by you changing, that's going to make your husband or your wife feel better. And unfortunately, I've found that counselling often takes this approach. You know, two people sit down and they each tell each other what upsets them about the other, and each person tries to change their behaviour as a way to make the other person feel better and to improve their relationship. And the problem with this, what this does is it pushes the responsibility for the way someone feels even more onto the other person. And that really doesn't work. Now let me give you a little clue here, if you're still not sure about how you actually do this or the importance of doing this. But one of the things I've found, and if you know about my story, you'll know that I came from a whole sort of string of failed relationships, if you like, including a couple of disastrous marriages. And I went from there to really go on a quest to discover what makes a relationship great. And I started to look at some of those few people, unfortunately very few people, who have amazing relationships, amazing marriages. And I started to look for the patterns, what they were doing, what they were thinking, what was going on that made their marriage very different from most people who are either struggling or just in a general state of unhappiness. And one common characteristic, one common element I've seen in phenomenally happy and successful marriages is that both people in that relationship take full and total responsibility for the way they feel and no responsibility for the way the other person feels. Now, this is not the same as not loving them, not wanting the other person to be happy, or even acting without caring about the consequences on your partner. But what it means is they allow the other person, in other words, their husband or their wife, to be responsible for their own feelings. And when you see two people in a relationship doing that, taking responsibility for only their feelings and not taking responsibility for the others, the results are absolutely astounding. It is amazing. So that's the first thing that's really important, which is make sure you don't take responsibility, no matter how difficult it might be, no matter how the reaction might be, and I'll give you some ideas later on how to deal with this, but it's very important that you don't take responsibility for how your husband or your wife feels. All right, that's the first thing. Now the second thing, and this really comes as a consequence of not taking responsibility for the way your husband or your wife feels, but this is the second thing you mustn't do, is take responsibility for their behavior and their actions. And all the same things apply, that really what they do is what they do. It's not your fault, despite what they may say. It's not up to you what they do. Now, obviously, you might want to change what they do, and in fact, I'm sure that you really do, but the truth is you have to let go. You have to make their behavior their responsibility and not take responsibility for trying to get them to change. Because the truth is, you're not going to get them to change their behavior, no matter what it is they're doing that you don't agree with. You're not going to get them to change if you take responsibility for it. You've got to get them to take responsibility for it. So again, you need to let go and just realize that what they do is up to them, good and bad. Again, not easy, but it is the truth. Alright, now the third thing you need to stop taking responsibility for in your marriage is your actual marriage situation. Now that's probably going to pop the navel of a few people listening to this, but before you reach for the switch off button, I want you to really think about something. You're not responsible for all of the things that are happening in your marriage right now. Now sure, you've done some things, and your spouse has done some things as well to create the situation you're in. But you feeling responsible for all of the things that have gone wrong, all that's going to do is going to make you feel bad. And as I'll show you later, feeling bad is totally counterproductive to doing anything to help save and strengthen your marriage. So take the blame from your situation off yourself by realizing that on one level you are not responsible for your marriage. I mean, obviously you can and you should do everything you can to save and make your marriage better, but you're not responsible for the outcome. Now there is a difference, and in my programs I go into this in a lot more detail, and unfortunately we don't have the time to really go into it with the depth, but there is a difference. So just think, how can I get to a mental place where I don't feel responsible for the situation that we're in? I will do everything I can to make, as I say, to get the result I want, but I'm not responsible for the situation. Alright, now if that last point has left you feeling a bit confused, I think what's going to help is when you realize what you are responsible for in your marriage, and in fact not only in your marriage but in your life. So if you're not responsible for your spouse's feelings, you're not responsible for their actions, and you're not responsible for your marriage, what are you responsible for? Well, that's easy. Well, I shouldn't say easy, it's simple. It's not easy, but it is simple. And you're actually only responsible for three things. And those three things are, firstly, your thoughts, secondly, your feelings, and thirdly, your actions. So what you think, feel, and do in any moment is totally up to you. And making sure that they are the thoughts, feelings, and actions that you actually want to have, and that are going to create the good results in your life, that is actually your only responsibility. And I'll tell you another thing, that not only is it your only responsibility, but your thoughts, feelings, and actions are actually the only things you're going to have any success in controlling anyway. Now, of course, again, this is not easy to do because it's the opposite, isn't it, to what we really think we should be doing. We're trying to control everything out there, in other words, our spouse's behavior and what's going on in our marriage, but what we should be focusing is what's inside us. And this really is probably the most difficult thing we're faced to do in our life. Everything out there in our life is pulling us in the direction of other things we can point to as the way we feel. things we can blame for the way we feel. In other words, we can blame our spouse for the way we feel, or our family, or our job, or, literally any circumstance in our life. We can find a way to blame for the way we feel. But the really interesting thing is, and we're getting quite deep here, so I hope you're still with me, but the really interesting thing is, what I've noticed is every great teacher throughout history that I've seen and I've studied has made this one point, and that is, we only have control over one thing, and that's our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. Okay, there are three things. And when we take responsibility for those, in other words, when we take responsibility for how we feel on the inside, that's how we get things to change on the outside. Now, as I said, this is pretty deep stuff, but the reason I'm going through this is because it's the absolute truth. And as far as your marriage is concerned, if you really want to save it, if you really want to improve things, you need to take responsibility, total responsibility for what you think and for how you feel. And again, in my programs, I focus on showing you very deeply and very clearly how to do this, but I just want to give you a couple of points in the time we've got left on what actually happens when you start taking full responsibility for your own thoughts, feelings, and actions, and when you stop taking responsibility for anything else, least of all for your spouse. So two very, very powerful things start to happen, and I think when I explain them to you, you'll be able to see that yes, you can see how those things would happen, and that will give you even more motivation to focus on taking responsibility for your own thoughts, feelings, and actions. But the first thing that happens when you do that is that you stop blaming your spouse. Now, think about it. If you're experiencing real problems in your relationship, say your spouse wants to leave you, say they've told you that they don't love you anymore, or they've found somebody else, and you're just not getting on, there's no communication, whatever it is, I'm sure you've been in a situation where you felt bitter and hurt and in pain. And a natural reaction is to blame them, isn't it? It's to put blame on them and say, how can you do this and it's all your fault or whatever. But put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Now, can you think, if you actually stop blaming them for your situation, even if you think it's their fault, all right? But just for a moment, if you can stop blaming them for your situation, and if you could stop pressuring them, or stop trying to make them feel bad, or trying to get them to change, do you think that if you stopped all of that they're going to feel better about you? Of course they are. There's not going to be the pressure, there's not going to be the ill feeling. And the truth is, the better they feel about you, the more likely they are to want to stay with you and work on your marriage. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? It's completely logical. So the point is, no matter how much you feel that they are in the wrong and it's their fault, you've got to stop laying the blame on them if you want to save your marriage. That's the first thing. And the second thing that happens when you take responsibility, and only responsibility for yourself, is that your spouse becomes forced to take responsibility for their thoughts, feelings, and actions. Now, that might be something completely new to them. And once you start working on taking responsibility for yourself and letting go of taking responsibility for them, it might be new for you as well. And the truth is, you have this understanding now that maybe they don't. All right? So once you stop taking responsibility for them, they're probably not going to like it. And I'm almost certain they won't like it. And you might find a bit of a negative backlash. They might start acting even worse towards you when you stop taking responsibility for them, when you expect them to take responsibility for their thoughts, feelings, and actions, and you no longer allow yourself to feel bad and to feel like you're the person who has to change things. So it could even get worse for a while. In fact, it probably will. And, if it does get worse for a while, then you're on the right track. You're getting a reaction, and it's a bit like if you like a small child. When you do something you know is good for them, and you know that they will appreciate later on, and you do something you know they need to learn, sure, they kick up and scream and shout, throw a tantrum first off, but eventually they are much better off, and you're much better off, and your relationship's much better off. So, really it's the same when you're in a situation when you're trying to save your marriage and you're facing resistance from your spouse, the same sort of thing. Because ultimately, if you stick to your guns, positive things are going to start to happen. You're going to stop playing the blame game, both of you. And when you do that, when you remove the blame game, and when both people are taking responsibility for themselves, whether they want to or not, you're going to start creating a new environment in which both of you can start communicating. You're starting to act in a different way. So those are two very, very powerful things that happen when you stop taking responsibility for them and you just focus on your own thoughts, feelings, and actions. Okay, so I hope I've been able to show you the importance of taking the right responsibility for your marriage situation and of stopping taking responsibility for things that really ultimately are out of your control. And once you get this difference clear in your mind, and you might like to listen to this podcast again just to get a bit clearer, once you get the difference clear, you can really develop the mental strength to stick to your guns in the face of what may well be opposition. But you're going to see a major shift for the better in your relationship. And the other great thing is you're going to feel a lot better about yourself, which is very, very important. And in my mind, really the most important thing is for you to feel good about yourself. That's even more important than your marriage, in my mind, because the purpose, obviously, of a marriage is for you to feel good. No point being in a marriage if you don't feel good. But you can feel good in a marriage. You can change your marriage if you do the right things. So I hope you found this helpful. If you're struggling with your marriage, I'd love the opportunity to help you on a more personal and deeper level by working with you through one of my programs. And you may already know that I've got two very powerful programs, very effective programs. There's my 7-day Stop Your Divorce, How to Save Your Marriage When Your Spouse Doesn't Want To. And that's very much for people who've getting resistance. Maybe your spouse is leaving or walking out the door, and this is a way to get things back on track super fast. And my other program, which is a more in-depth program, is my Save Your Marriage Relationship Transformation program. And that shows you how to communicate properly, how to rebuild the intimacy in your relationship, how to get you and your partner working together again, and creating the magic relationship that you want to have in your marriage and you deserve to have, and it's the only sort of marriage worth having. So you can find out all the details on my website, of course, liamnaden.com, where you can also listen to find the other podcast episodes to listen to as well. So that's all we've got time for today. Sincerely, I wish you all the best. I hope you not only overcome the problems in your marriage, but I really hope that you go on to create a fabulous marriage, because it really is the most important thing in our life, I think, is the quality of the relationship we're in. And it really is worth putting in a bit of time, a bit of effort with the right knowledge and right information, which is what I'm trying to give you in these podcasts, and obviously in my programs as well. It's really worth spending a bit of time to get things right, because it's going to impact the rest of your life. So that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks again for listening. Talk to you soon, and bye for now.